tell you about the Battle of Haw River. It's also known as Pyle's Defeat, Pyle's Massacre, and Pyle's Hacking Match, and probably a few more that I don't know about. So the battle, if you want to call it that, took place in southern North Carolina, which is actually north of northern South Carolina. Now in August of 1780 was the disaster at Camden. General Gates was relieved, and then in December, Nathaniel Greene took over. Fast forward to February, Cornwallis had not closed with Greene yet, and he wanted to, and he was chasing him, and Greene was good at running. Cornwallis, as he's chasing Greene, stopped, and he said, you know what? Let's gather as many loyalists as we can. That was Americans who were still loyal to King George III. As we gather more and more men, we'll be able to bring more men onto the battlefield. So a guy named John Pyle was a medical doctor, and he was the colonel of a 400-man loyalist unit that he had just raised. Once he raised it, he sent a message to Cornwallis and said, could we please have an escort into camp? I don't want to get bushwhacked because I got a bunch of Americans with me. So on the British side, you had Colonel John Pyle, and on the American side, you had a guy named Henry Lee. Now he was Robert E. Lee's dad, and he was in charge of the American Legion. The American Legion. The American Legion. Now, a lot of people back then, they were much more educated than they are now. He really liked Roman stuff, and he had a green jacket and a helmet with a plume on it, kind of like a Roman centurion. And then, of course, the name Legion was a Roman army type of name. And he was a bad dude. Now, with Henry Lee's American Legion was a guy named General Andrew Pickens. He was a fantastic fighter and well respected from the British, the Americans, and the Indians. In fact, the Indians called him the Wizard Owl. I'll go into that one another time. He was with Lee. They were combing the woods looking for British to whoop. Now, one important thing to remember, Lee had a green jacket, a helmet, and a plume, and so did a lot of his cavalry guys. Tarleton, the British guy that John Pyle was supposed to link up with, wore exactly the same thing. Green jacket, little helmet, little plume. All the dudes behind him had the same thing. So when John Pyle's two scouts ran in to Henry Lee out in the woods, they thought it was Tarleton, and Lee let them believe it. Lee asked the scouts where Pyle and his men were, and the guys told him. So Lee said, good deal, we'll be there in a little bit. The scouts went back to Pyle, told their commander, hey, we just linked up with Tarleton, and Tarleton's about to come. So Pyle's men got on both sides of the road, stood at attention on horseback, had their weapons slung, and were looking straight ahead as if in parade review. Now Lee broke up into several groups. He was trying to completely surround Pyle and get him to surrender. Talk about nerves of steel, ice water in his veins. Henry Lee had it. He went right down the middle of those guys lined up on either side of the road with his guys behind him. He got all the way to where Pyle was in the middle of the road, several hundred yards that way. And the whole time he had been walking, he was saying, looking good, mighty fine, pretty sharp looking guys for a bunch of Americans. And then he got to Pyle, shook his hand, and right as he had Pyle's hand, shooting started in the back. Now there's several stories. Did the Americans start it? Did the British start it? Either way, everything went crazy. The Americans, who were expecting to possibly fight, immediately drew their swords and started hacking away at these guys with their rifles slung over their shoulder. Within just a few minutes, there were over 90 dead loyalists laying on the ground, and all the rest had run out into the woods. It was such a complete surprise attack, Lee kind of felt bad. He had wanted to surround them, make them surrender without anybody dying on either side. At the end of this massacre, a prisoner was brought forward, and the prisoner pointed at him and yelled, "Sir, you've just killed as good a group of your king's men as there ever was." And Lee said, "You rascal, I'm Lee of the American Legion." He was ticked off at the guy. All this, and you still think I'm Tarleton? Come on, man. This battle or incident or massacre or defeat or whatever you want to call it had some effects. Tarleton ran back to Cornwallis. He didn't want to be hanging out in the woods with a couple guys like Lee and Pickens. Secondly, this battle prevented Cornwallis from getting the loyalist enlistments he thought he was going to get. Every time they got in a fight, they would lose a bunch of guys, even if they won the battle, and yet he kept losing men and couldn't replace them. It took weeks, even months, to get guys over from England, so you didn't have immediate replacements. This battle was important in that it kept loyalists from joining Cornwallis, and it was one of the reasons he had to surrender.